provide the public with an assurance.
Grant Robertson.
Thank you, Mr Chair, and I'm sure my colleague Claire Curran will continue with her contribution on this bill in a further call on this part. Mr Chair, part 2 is the interception capability part of the bill, and as Claire Curran has said, this is really where the balance between protecting New Zealanders' security and protecting New Zealanders' rights and freedoms to communicate with one another have to be put into balance. And as Claire Curran has also already said in the earlier legislation that this bill amends, that balance was already put there. There was an acknowledgement that network providers, network operators as they're now defined here, would have roles and responsibilities around allowing for an interception capability. No matter what we might like to think about the world, there are people out there who may well be wanting to do things involving cyber networks in New Zealand that are against the law, that put New Zealanders in danger, and therefore that capability is something that we on this side of the House accept. What we don't accept, Mr Chair, is allowing that capability to be opened up to such an extent that an enormous power now rests in the hands of the Minister around where that capability is used, on what networks, and what obligations are now on the providers of those networks. And again, Mr Chair, this is not just about opposition politics, this is not just about getting up and saying this is a government bill, we oppose it. The Select Committee heard submission after submission from those who are directly involved in provision of internet services, provision of networks in New Zealand, that this part of the bill would have the effect of stifling innovation, potentially reducing investment in New Zealand by large telecommunication companies, by the over-the-top providers that Claire Curran mentioned before, and that it would overall extend out the powers of the Minister in such a way that that necessary balance between protecting our security and the freedoms of New Zealand would go out of balance. And in the Select Committee, Microsoft came and they said an obligation to have interception capability on a fundamentally different technology to what we have seen in the past, in our view, needs to be considered on its merits, not swept up in broad legislation that gives wide powers to surveillance agencies and ministers. And that's the point. It's not that Microsoft is saying we should not have any interception capability requirements upon us, but that it shouldn't be part of legislation like this that is loose, poorly defined and associated with a massive expansion in the powers of the surveillance agencies, in this case the GCSB through the GCSB Act, and through an expansion in the powers of the ministers. So Microsoft has come along and they have said that. They've also said, and this is, comes to clause 39, which we can still be debating because it's actually in the minister's SOP that we'll vote on later on, and she's decided to delete clause 39 after a massive backlash from across the telecommunications industry. But what that signal sent from the minister with clause 39 was that New Zealand was trying to, in some way or other, shut itself off from the rest of the world and actually cut off the possibility of innovation within this kind of the ICT sector in New Zealand. And it is interesting to note, I'm reading a column here from the National Business Review about the burden that New Zealand-based businesses will face. So it's one thing for the Microsofts and the Googles and the Apples of this world to come and say, we don't like the burden that this bill is going to place upon us, and they have a legitimate claim in there. But what about New Zealand providers? What about those who are the providers, for instance, of cloud services, where New Zealand actually has a very good reputation in terms of had a very good reputation in terms of the development of innovative cloud technology. Well, what's been said by those who provide that is that this actually over time will put huge costs on those providers and essentially make them weaker in comparison to the international cloud service providers. So here we have the national government, supposedly the friend of business, bringing a piece of legislation to the House that's actually going to stifle innovation. It's potentially going to shut off interest internationally, but it's actually going to stifle innovation from New Zealand companies. And the New Zealand businesses who will have to be able to put their services up against this law and say, have we got the capability the New Zealand government want, will simply walk away, in my view, Mr Chair, when they see this kind of approach from the Minister. So if we look at it both from the terms of those companies from overseas, Mr Chair,
Grant Robertson.
those companies from overseas and companies from New Zealand, the powers that are in Part 2 of this bill around interception capability quite simply greatly put a great deal of extra cost on those companies and potentially stifle the innovation that they will be part of. So in Part 2, how does this come about? Well, there's a range of ways that, that Part 2 does this, but essentially the area that I want to focus this part of my contribution on is around Section 35 of the bill. And this is the part of the bill where Claire Curran has an amendment to establish a technical advisory board. Because what we see here is the classic expansion of ministerial power. Again, from a government supposedly, a national party supposedly all about reducing government and reducing the size, the impact of the state, we now have enormously expanded powers. Subpart 5, ministerial directions. The Minister may require service providers to have the same obligations as network operators. 35, 36 and 37 go through the way in which the Minister will do that. Everything is in the control of the Minister. There is a review provision put in here under Section 36, but it's totally within the control of the Minister. And the expansion of powers, alongside the complete control of the Minister, is, as my colleague Claire Curran interjected before, unprecedented. This legislation is loose, it is poorly defined, and it breaks new ground. That combination is something that all New Zealanders should be very, very concerned about. And that's why, Mr Chair, that under the SOP that we have here, we are looking to establish a technical advisory board. Now, this technical advisory board would at least have the ability to be somewhat independent from the Minister. In the SOP that Claire Curran has put forward, the Minister only appoints members of the Technical Advisory Board after consulting with representatives from the telecommunications industry. It needs to comprise equal representation from government and the industry with an independent chair. Any matter referred to the Minister requesting they exercise their discretion or recommend providing an additional area of specified security interest must first be referred to the Technical Advisory Board, and it has to be established with the purpose of increasing expertise in relation to network security and consideration of proposed mitigations. At least if we have this in the law, we can have some reassurance that the Minister's increased powers will not be abused. The industry wants this. They've come to the committee and said, can we have something like this? And the government has ignored them. Consistently throughout the process of this bill, the government has ignored the warnings of industry, ignored the warnings of the very people who provide these services to New Zealanders. And it's not like they've been unreasonable. As late as the last couple of weeks, telecommunication groups have been writing to the Minister saying, please can we meet with you to talk about how we can mitigate some of the problems we see in here. They're not walking away. They're not saying they don't want to be a part of a regime in New Zealand that provides that balance of security, and the Minister won't talk to them. The Minister will not talk to them. The Minister puts up some tweaks in her SOP. She gets rid of the clause that's causing her the most grief. But in reality, that does not change the fact that this bill breaks new ground, is unprecedented in the level of power it gives to the Minister and the expansion of powers it creates for the surveillance agencies. And yet here we are, Mr Speaker, the day after the second reading, with the government trying to shove through this bill through this week, get it out of the way. Well, Mr Speaker, Mr Chair, that is simply not the way to make good law. This is an area that is technical, it is difficult, it is in an area of technology that a lot of people don't fully understand. It's exactly the kind of law where there should be time taken, where we should be able to get buy-in from industry, and in this Part 2, on interception capability, the industry is crying out to be listened to say, yes, we will take on our responsibilities to allow for interception capability, but not at any cost, and not with wide open powers for the Minister to do just as she pleases. So, Mr Chair, we would call on all members of the House to support the SOP on clause that inserts into clause 35 the new Technical Advisory Board. At least that will give New Zealanders some assurance that there will be an independent overview of the Minister's powers. The Minister has seen fit to take out Clause 39. Now is the time for the Minister to accept that there needs to be some limits placed on the powers. This is what industry wants from this bill. It's time that the so-called business-friendly national government actually gets off its chuff and does something to support industry.
Mr. Chair.
The Honourable Amy Adams.
Mr. Chair, I'm very happy to take a call actually in this bill, and I've been waiting all evening for something to come up in debate that was worth responding to, and wasn't more of the misinformation and scaremongering and beat-up rhetoric that we've heard from opposition parties all through this debate. And I've waited and we